When you know how to speak concisely, it helps you share your words with your audience in a way that lands with polish and impact and power. And in today's episode, I'm going to teach you how to do that so that you can be super impressive when you speak. I'm going to teach you 3 things. Number 1, the biggest mistake people make with conciseness. Number 2, 2 simple tools to help you be more concise. And number 3, I'm going to walk you through some examples so you know how to apply these tools. Let's dive in. Welcome to The Art of Speaking Up, a podcast that helps professional women access the limitless potential that lies within them. I'm your host, Jessica Guzik, and my mission is to help you find that spark inside you that has the power to transform your career in ways you may not have thought possible. I'm so excited that you're here. And now, on to the show. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today, we are talking about such an important topic, which is how to be concise when you are speaking. This is a really smart goal to have in mind when it comes to your verbal communication. Because as you learn to speak more concisely, your words tend to land with more impact and power. When you're able to be crisp and precise with your words, it can create that mic drop experience and those mic drop moments with your audience where what you're sharing just comes off really, really powerful. And this helps you look really good. It helps you look more authoritative. It will help your audience respect you more. And possibly even better than that, when you learn to be concise in the way that you speak and the way that you share information, what typically happens is you end up facilitating a much deeper discussion with your stakeholders and with your audience. Because when you're concise, what happens is they understand you more clearly. They don't get confused. The things that you're saying just make sense to them. So they don't have to spend a lot of time asking you questions and working through their confusion. They get what you're saying. It clicks with them. And because it clicks, they can now have a higher level conversation with you. Instead of them having to have a conversation where they're just trying to make sense of what you're saying and just trying to understand it, they can have a bigger, deeper conversation about what your work means for the business. And when you have those bigger, deeper conversations with leaders, with your boss, with executives at your company, not only do you move your work forward in a much more powerful way, but also, number 1, they begin to see you as more of a leader. Because when they're talking with you and having conversations with you, they're not in the weeds. You're having these high-level important conversations with them. So they associate you with high-level important conversations. They see you as more of a leader. And also, because you're having those higher level conversations with them, your professional relationships with those stakeholders deepen. So being concise literally makes the difference between a meeting or a conversation that gets stuck in the weeds versus a conversation that moves forward in a way that is so powerful that not only does your work move forward more effectively, but you are really able to play the role of the leader. Like you're able to be a true leader in that room and in that conversation because of the quality of discussion that you are facilitating. And it all starts with clear and concise communication, which is what I'm going to be teaching you in today's episode. And I get really excited about this. So prepare for me to nerd out because I'm so excited to teach this with you. So what I'm going to start with is the biggest mistake that I see people make when it comes to being concise. And my hope is that this is going to help you see that conciseness might actually be easier than you think it is. Before I dive into that, I haven't introduced myself. So if you're new to the podcast, welcome. I'm so happy you're here. I'm so happy you found it. Please feel free to come say hi to me. I will put my contact information in the show notes. But I'm Jess. I'm the host of this podcast. The Art of Speaking Up is a New York Times featured podcast. And I am a coach for women in the corporate space. My mission is to offer you the tools and the confidence that you need to become a leader, because I want more female leaders in the corporate space, because I had a corporate career. I was super successful. I did become a really high up leader, but I struggled in the beginning of my career a lot, like a lot. And I created this podcast as the resource, like the honest, transparent, useful resource that I wish I would have had in the early parts of my career where I was really struggling to like find my voice and feel confident at work. So welcome. I'm so glad you're here. And let's talk about the biggest mistake that people make when it comes to being concise. People assume that what conciseness means is it just means like you're using less words, you're using less detail, you're cutting the fluff. And while it is true that we don't want to share a lot of fluff with our audience, and while it is true that we want to be aware of elevating the level of our information and not including too much detail when we're talking to an executive audience, that view really simplifies what conciseness is and makes it difficult for you to actually be more concise. So I want to share with you my definition, which does have some overlap with the idea of using fewer words, but that's not at all how I approach conciseness. And when I teach my clients conciseness inside my program, the Art of Speaking Up Academy, there's never like any framework or any lesson where I tell them to use fewer words, because that's not the most effective way to be concise. And that's also just a very difficult thing to do. Like just telling yourself to use fewer words is very, very challenging to implement, and it doesn't even result in the best communication. So I want to tell you how I view it and what I teach instead. And I hope this is going to help you see that conciseness is not as difficult as it might seem. So I define conciseness as speaking in a way that creates a feeling of ease for your audience. That is how I define it. So if when you're speaking and sharing information, your audience feels confused and stressed and overwhelmed, we have not hit the bar for conciseness. But if as you're speaking, your audience feels like it's easy, it's clicking, it's making sense, they're having an experience of ease, that's how we know we've met the bar for conciseness. One of the ways that I think about this, and a really useful analogy that I hope will help you understand this, is to compare the Apple Store with the electronic section of Best Buy. So when you walk into an Apple Store, typically, I'll share my experience, I have a feeling of ease. Like when I walk into the Apple Store, assuming it's not wildly crowded, but typically I have an experience of ease. The layout is nice. It's very inviting. You just kind of feel happy to step in there and look through the products. Whereas when I walk into the electronic section of Best Buy, which has many of the same items as the Apple Store, not exactly the same, but very similar. But when I walk into the electronic section of Best Buy, I don't have that feeling of ease. It doesn't feel good. I don't want to like stay there and hang out. Now, what's so interesting is that the Apple Store, at least the ones that I've been to, they often have way more items than the electronic section at Best Buy, because at Best Buy, that's just like one section of the entire store. It's not like super, super huge. And yet somehow the Apple Store feels more easeful for me. And this example is really intended to show you that when it comes to creating a feeling of ease in your audience, it's not about the amount. It's not about the quantity. It's not about having the least items in the Apple Store or the least words in your communication. It's about the overall experience that your audience has. You could take a very large Apple Store that has an enormous amount of inventory, and you could take a very small Best Buy that has a very tiny electronic section that has way fewer items than the Apple Store. And you could still go in the Apple Store and have more of a feeling of ease and more of a preference to browse the electronics in that store because it feels more easeful. So I hope this is helping you see that creating a feeling of ease isn't always about there being less. It's about us thinking about the experience that our audience is having. And to drive this point home even more strongly, I want us to think together about things that are very lengthy, like things that we don't at all think about as being concise, but that we still really enjoy as an audience. So I was thinking to myself, what's an example of something very long that no one who loves it complains about how long it is? And I thought about like the Harry Potter series or the Lord of the Rings trilogy and how long those books are. And you never hear people say, I wish book one was shorter, or I wish this book was shorter. No, like people love it even though it's long. And so it's not about the amount, it's about the experience. It's about the experience that our audience has. So in today's episode, I'm going to teach you conciseness in a similar way that I teach it to my clients in the Art of Speaking Up Academy, which is we're not going to talk about using less words because, like I mentioned with these examples of the Apple Store and Lord of the Rings, it's not about the amount. And if we focus too much on the amount and just there being less and less, we really miss the opportunity to think at a higher level, a deeper level about how we can create an easeful experience for our audience. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you 2 tools that will help you create an experience of ease when you are sharing information with your audience. And the good news is they're easy to remember because they both start with the letter S. We're going to have a super quick break, and then I'm going to dive in and teach you what these are. Hey, Jess, I had a question for you. What's your question? Well, the desk that you're working at is, the desk that I'm working at is what? Well, it's my desk, and I was wondering if I could use it. I mean, only if that's cool with you. Only if, that doesn't bother you. Oh, you mean I'm sitting at your desk and you want your desk back? Yes, but if it's an inconvenience or if it's annoying or it bothers you, please don't worry. I'm totally fine. Okay, you need to download Jess's free ebook. What's the ebook about? It's all about assertiveness, which, no offense, you kind of need some help with. No, I don't want to be assertive. I don't want to become one of those people who's aggressive and obnoxious and rude. That's so not me. That's exactly why you need the ebook. Jess teaches you how to be assertive in a way that's strong and powerful, yet also respectful and authentic. Oh, interesting. You mean like me saying, hey, Jess, mind if I get my desk back? I have some work to do. Exactly. Okay, I get it. I do need this ebook. Where do I find it? Go to assertivenessebook.com or click the link in the show notes. And also, here's your desk back. And we're back. And quick reminder of what we've covered so far. I've shared this idea that conciseness is about so much more than just eliminating words and details. It's about creating that experience of ease for your audience. And I'm going to share with you 2 tools that will help you create an experience of ease. And they both start with the letter S, so that will make them easier for you to remember. So the 2 tools that will help you be more concise and create a feeling of ease for your stakeholders are story and structure. So I'm going to explain what story and structure are, and then I'm going to walk you through an example of how to apply these, because I know it can be so helpful, and my clients so often tell me that when they hear an example or they see a sample script, it really helps it click for them. So I'm going to share with you some examples of how to apply these tools. So story is the first of the 2 tools, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Story is about taking the ideas and information you're sharing and overlaying a story or a narrative. Now, this one is best learned by example. So when I give you the example of it, I think you're going to really understand what I mean by it and how to apply it to your communication. Structure is the second tool that you can use to be more concise. And structure just means breaking things into parts. That's all it means. It just means taking something big and breaking it into parts. And I'm going to give examples of that as well. Now, going back to this idea that I shared that people really like Lord of the Rings and really like Harry Potter, even though those are very long. Those are not concise books, especially Lord of the Rings. I haven't read Lord of the Rings, but I just know that they're very, very long. I have read Harry Potter, which I don't think is as long as Lord of the Rings, but if you put all 7 Harry Potter books, in a row, that's a lot of pages of reading. But with either one of those, we can see how story and structure are being used to create an experience of ease for the audience, despite the fact that the books are long. So story is really obvious, right? When you're reading Lord of the Rings or reading Harry Potter, there's a story happening. It's not just like you read Harry Potter and it's just like a long list of like random spells and random things about this world of magic. There's a coherent plot that we become interested in. And it's that plot and that story that creates the feeling of ease and makes us want to read more and go more deeply into it. We also see structure being used alongside story. So Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, they're divided into books, and the books are divided into chapters, and often the chapters are divided into subsections. Now, I want you to imagine if Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings had no chapters and had no subsections, and if it was just one long book where you just kept going and going and going, that like I'm getting stressed just thinking about that, right? Like that would not create a feeling of ease. And so these books are a really beautiful example of how both story and structure can take something that is not concise, that is very long, that has a lot to it, and make it really easeful for the audience. Now, of course, when you're sharing your work and communicating in a corporate setting or in a professional environment, it's obviously not the same as a fiction book, right? But the principles that make those fiction books easy to read and appealing to people are the same principles that make any kind of communication easy to read and appealing to people. So we can learn from Lord of the Rings, we can learn from Harry Potter, we can extract the things that those books do that make them appealing to the reader. And we can take those things and apply it to our communication in a corporate setting. And the best way for you to learn how to do this is via an example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a fictional scenario with you, and I'm going to talk through how I would apply story and structure to help make something that isn't super concise feel much more concise for my audience. So here's what I want you to imagine. I want you to imagine that the CEO of your company taps you on the shoulder and says, "Hey, listen, I know you're not on the finance team." Or by the way, if you are in a finance role, then hey, I know you're on the finance team. The CEO taps you on the shoulder and says, "Hey, I have something that I need really urgently, and my head of finance, who would normally share this with me, is not in, and this is really important." So here's the context. As you probably know, this year, our company, we missed our revenue goal. And I really want to understand why our company missed our revenue goal. Would you be able to prepare for me a slide that shows our revenue month by month? So I want to see our revenue for the entire year broken out month by month from January through December. Could you prepare that for me? And I'm going to have my assistant set up a meeting with you and you can bring that and walk me through it. Okay, so whether you're in a finance role or not, I want you to imagine this is an emergency situation and the CEO has asked you to put this together. So you get the data and you have 12 months of data, January through December, and each month has a different revenue number. And the CEO has asked you to walk them through it. And they want to go through this in detail to understand why this year's revenue was off. So I want you to imagine that you make a slide that lists out every month. And for every single month, it lists out what your company's revenue was that month. So what I want to offer to you is that this slide is not concise because this slide has 24 pieces of information on it. It has 12 months on it, January through December, and it has 12 numbers on it, the revenue for January through December. So you are going to be bringing this to the CEO, and you have to decide, how am I going to walk the CEO through this? How am I going to walk the CEO through 24 data points in a way that's concise? Now, remember in the beginning when I told you concise isn't about having less, it's about creating a feeling of ease. This is such a good example of how that's true there's no way for you to reduce the amount of information. Like, you have 24 data points. You can't just take out the month of November and only show the CEO 11 months or 22 data points, right? Like, sometimes taking out information isn't an option. This is why I personally don't like to define conciseness as just fewer details, fewer words, fewer pieces of information. That's why I don't teach it that way to my clients, because number one, that's not the best way to do it. And number two, as you can see in this example, that doesn't always work. You can't eliminate any information from this slide. So I want you to imagine that you have this slide with all these data points and you're like, how am I going to walk the CEO through this? I can't be like, in January, it was 1, and in February, it was 1.2, and in March, it was 1.3, and in April, it was 1.2 again, right? Like, if you just go through the slide in that way, that is not going to be an effective way to communicate that to the CEO. It's going to feel very not concise. And so what we want to do is we want to use the tools of story and or structure to present that non-concise information in a super concise way. So first, I'm going to show you how you could use story to make the information more concise. And then I'm going to show you how you could use structure to make the information more concise. And as you will see, story and structure very often overlap with one another. So if you were to use story to make those 24 data points more concise, what you would ask yourself is there a story, a narrative, a plot that I can identify in this information? And the best way to do that, a way that I find really helpful, is to think about the classic fairy tale structure, where many fairy tales start with once upon a time. So the way that I would do it literally in my head is I would look at the data and I would think to myself, if I was telling someone a story and I was saying to that person, once upon a time, there was a company that generated 12 months worth of revenue. If I was to share the story in that way, then what would the rest of the story be? What is that fairy tale? What is that once upon a time that I'm seeing in this information? So some examples of what that story or narrative could look like is it could be something like, once upon a time, we started the year really strong and we were growing in the first half of the year. But as we started to hit the third and fourth quarters, our revenue started to plateau and then it started to decline. That's a story, right? I put a narrative, I put a plot around the information. Another example of how that story could sound is, once upon a time, our company found itself struggling in the first half of the year, and we missed our projections for the first 3 months. And after that, we were able to regroup and reorganize and hit our projections, but we weren't able to compensate for the missed revenue in the first 3 months. So those are both examples of stories. When I share that story, the CEO is going to get it. It's going to click. It's going to feel easy. Now, if I want to, I can go into some of the details and I can say, as you can see, look at our numbers in January and February. We're at 1.1, 1.2. We're below the projections. But then if you come over here into the later months, you can see we're at these higher numbers and we're hitting our projections. And I didn't cover every single of the 24 data points, but it doesn't matter because my CEO got the exact information that they needed without me having to tediously go through it one after the other. Now, one thing that I want to call out here is different stakeholders will have different preferences for how much detail they like to go into. This is why I also don't like to define conciseness as just as little words and as little detail as possible, because you could have one CEO who might say, great, that makes so much sense. Thank you so much for putting this together. I think I have what I need. But you might have another CEO who has a different problem-solving style, a different way of thinking, And that CEO might say, okay, great, that makes so much sense. Let's go through it month by month together. So they might want to go into the details with you, but it's still so important that you started with story. Because if you launched that CEO into the details like month after month, it would not click for them. It would be an overwhelming way to share the information. Because you started with the story, they now have appetite to go into the details. But it's really, really important to realize that your stakeholders will have different preferences in terms of how much detail they want to go into. So as you're sharing the story, you might then want to say something to your stakeholder like, that's the bigger picture of what we saw happening this year. I've got some more detail in terms of the revenue month by month. Do you want to take a closer look at that? And you can let your audience actually guide you so that you can offer them the information in the way that they like to consume it. And you're going to have a better discussion with them as a result. Okay, so that's the example of how you would use story. And when you're trying to apply story to your work, like let's say you're working on a slide and you're like, oh my gosh, there's so much information on this slide. Like, how the heck am I going to explain this to my audience? I want you to zoom out and ask yourself if there is a story. And I really want you to say to yourself, like, okay, if I overlay the classic fairy tale beginning of Once Upon a Time, is there like a once upon a time story of what is happening with this information? And the more you do this, the more you will get better at finding the story. And also, it will make it so much easier for you to share information and present slides because literally, stories are the easiest way that we as humans share and receive information. So when you have the story in your head, sharing the information is going to feel so much easier. Now, that being said, not every slide has a story. Not every piece of information has a super coherent story. And this is why I like to have that second tool, structure. So let's go back to this example of sharing all of the data with the CEO, like the monthly revenue data. I want you to imagine you look at each month, you look at your company's revenue for that month, and you can see no discernible pattern. There is no clear story. Like maybe there's a month or two where the revenue targets were missed or whatever, but you're like, I just don't see a cohesive story in this. No problem. This is when you can fall back on structure. And structure literally just means breaking it up into parts. So an example of how you could use structure to be more concise when presenting these 24 data points is you could say, hey, CEO, here's the information you requested. I'm going to walk you through it quarter by quarter. Let's start with Q1. So for Q1, here's what we're seeing for January, February, and March. Moving over to Q2, here's what we're seeing for April, May, and June. Q3, here's what we've got for July, August, and September. And then finally, Q4, here's what we're seeing for October, November, and December. This is an example of using pure structure to make it more concise. And just like I told you at the beginning, if Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings was just one long book with no chapters, with no breaks, with no sections, it would feel totally overwhelming. So what you're doing in this example is you're literally adding chapters or breaks. This just makes the information less overwhelming for your audience. It also makes it easier for you to deliver it, right? Because you have sections or chunks to share the information. Now, what's really cool about this, and where I'm gonna nerd out at my most maximum levels, is that a lot of times you can use both story and structure, and this is where your communication gets really, really good. So an example of using both story and structure would sound something like saying to the CEO this, saying, here's the information that you asked for. As we look at a year's worth of revenue data, what we see is that we had a slow start to the year where we missed our targets. And even though we hit our targets later in the year, we weren't able to make up for the lost revenue. So let me first walk you through Q1. So this is the quarter where we weren't able to hit our revenue targets. As you can see, we're at 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3 for January, February, and March. Now, starting in April, this is where we started to get closer to our targets. And even though we didn't hit our target in April, we're only at 1.15, we came closer. And then in May, we started to hit our targets. And for the rest of the year, you can see that we were able to hit our targets, but we didn't make up for the lost revenue. So in this example, I'm sharing the story, but I'm also breaking it into parts and using structure by saying, hey, let's look at January, February, March, right? Like I made a little chunk, I created a little section, and that section fed into the overall story. So this is the way that you want to think about presenting information. You want to try to find the story, you want to try to find the structure, and you want to use both of those things to share the information with your audience. Now, the cool thing about structure, and this is something that I nerd out with a lot when I'm supporting my clients in the Art of Speaking Up Academy, but the cool thing about structure is you can apply structure to anything. You can have the messiest slide, the messiest information, like the most chaotic thing. It literally doesn't matter. There's always a way to overlay structure. And when you overlay structure onto something chaotic or busy or detailed, it takes that detailed, busy thing and the structure simplifies it for your audience. And this is so important for me to share with you because the way that you stand out in corporate is not by being the person who shares the simplest, most concise information. You stand out by being the person who can take complicated information and make it simple and concise. Those are two different things. When you take something complex and simplify it, you are helping the CEO, you are helping your stakeholders, you are helping your boss more quickly take in the information to make an effective decision. You are helping them be more valuable in their role and use their time more effectively because they're not wasting brain space and energy trying to understand the information. You made it simple for them. They already understand it. They can now jump into the highest value thing that they can possibly do for the company, which is to use their business thinking and their smarts and their leadership to make a decision about moving forward. So when you go in front of the CEO and you share that year's worth of revenue data with that story and with that structure, the CEO has their answers so fast. And instead of them having to spend 30 minutes trying to take in all the information and look at the revenue month after month, they get it quickly. They can now go to the far more important and valuable thing that they want to do, which is great. Based on what I now understand about what went wrong with revenue, what is the next step that I'm going to take this company in? And when you are the person who facilitated that next step, you get credit for creating that value. This is why executive communication and good communication is so freaking important because it translates to your stakeholders being more successful in their roles. And when they are more successful, and part of the reason that they're more successful is because of you, guarantee you, they're going to want to keep you around as long as possible. They're going to want to retain you. They're going to want to give you their most important projects, and they're going to want to make sure you're happy because they want you to be happy so that you stay and you keep helping them succeed. And high quality, crisp, concise communication is how you do that. It helps your audience and it helps you further your career. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. If you found this useful, please share it with a friend or coworker who you think would benefit from it. I am so grateful to have you here. And if you want to grab my free ebook on assertive communication, you will find the link in the show notes. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you in next week's episode. Bye.